Welcome back to your extra computer history with Chris Garcia. I am, in fact, Chris Garcia. I wanted to start by sort of giving an idea of a single machine, in this case, Sage, the semi-automatic ground environment. And there's a reason for choosing this machine, because what happened in the 1960s in computing was greatly influenced by Sage, both technologically and commercially. And that shouldn't be a shock, because it was a massive project, and the individual computers were massive. In the 1950s, the United States wanted to develop an air defense network, something that could take inputs from radar and place them into connection with one another, so that we had a net over the entire United States airspace. This came out of the Whirlwind project, and at one point was led by Jay Forrester, the man who invented core memory that was turned practical by other companies, but very much so deployed in Whirlwind. And I believe the initial prototype was referred to as Whirlwind 2, but there's also many layers to this and versions. Sage, as it was developed, gave contracts to many companies. IBM had the principal hardware contract, and they developed not only the computing capabilities, but the I/O capability. And most famously, they have these beautiful screens that are large radar scopes like. The Computer History Museum had a number of these. I think we had 2 full weapons directors and several ancillary pieces, along with a large number, probably 10, pieces of the actual computation segments, which were vacuum tubes, so they were massive. And it came from North Bay, Ontario. There are so many stories here that are sociological, both internal and external of the system. The external is, of course, we wanted to know what was going on in our airspace, because we were in the Cold War with the Russians. And the fear when this was being developed was that the Russians would fly a plane over and drop bombs on us. By the time this was fully deployed, the intercontinental ballistic missile was around, and that would have made this almost completely useless. There's also some who claim that if a series of bombers had come over the U.S., there would have been no way we could have stopped all of them. Still, better than nothing. But this idea that we were on alert, that we were prepared to defend our airspace, is a real key to this sort of system. And the application of computers to defense goals goes back, of course, to the beginning of the computer. ENIAC is the very notable piece on that. But more importantly, it's not only the internal, it is also the external. The Russians knew we had this. And while the plans and methodologies may have been secret, their existence was not. There were many spies in the U.S., and there were films like In Your Defense or I think it was On Alert, that were promoting Sage as a thing that existed. And part of that was to let the Russians know, we have this. We can stop you. It's a very, very powerful piece when you tell your opponent that we can stop your attack, even if you're not being 100% true. Another external thing that comes from this is how it impacted the general culture of computing. Now, to enable the whole system to continue working if, say, a nuke was dropped on Denver, but you still wanted to be able to communicate from the San Francisco block to the New York block, you had to have a way to reroute that so it wasn't going to be destroyed by a single node going out. And there are many systems that had been developed like that, early networks, that were dependent on a single node. Everything passed through one location. This decentralized network was massively important because it allowed you to keep communications when things go down, which is a key element within ARPANET, developed in the late 1960s, finally delivered in 1969, and which led to, of course, the internet. So this idea that decentralization allows for continuation if tragedy happens has been baked into the internet, largely because of Sage. Other cultural things that I really like, though, when you would unscrew, they have these sort of, I guess they're screw tops to block off areas that were used for maybe test equipment or something or other. But they would have, people would be on this for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. So they would write on the back, "Don't you feel useless? Bored beyond belief." Things like that. It's just a way to express, I'm so bored. Possibly as a part of that, they included a cigarette lighter and ashtray on the weapons directors. And I couldn't imagine people smoking in a computer lab today. But back then, apparently, it was perfectly fine. One of the other interesting things here is that early forms of online search were developed for Sage. And while I've never really gotten the full concept behind it, I think it was an idea that you could look through to find information that was stored on the remote machines relating to where you were dealing with at the time. Because any one of these, if it were needed, could launch a full assault to stop the incoming incursion. In other words, they could take over the entire American airspace from any individual point, which is really a fascinating idea. That also might not be the truth, but I do know that Air Command could be certainly signaled from one specific location. There were multiple forms of I/O here that were really innovative, one of which being the light gun. And it looks like a ray gun out of a 1950 science fiction film, but you could actually point and you could squeeze the trigger and it would come up with information on a little small CRT next to the larger CRT. They also had basically a room projection. They would have a map projected on the wall and a very large curved screen, and it would have points and you could see where planes were going and access things like that. Really impressive machine. But by the time it was delivered, it was obsolete. Does that make it a failure? No. While it was not serving the role that it intended, one, it gave a number of servicemen their first actual time on a computer. I believe most notably Les Ernest, one of the famous individuals at the Stanford AI Lab, had worked on Sage. And you can definitely see sort of people who came out of that project working in many different ways in all these arenas. IBM took this huge contract and turned it into R&D. And by 1960, they had already had a successful line of business computers and scientific computers, not to mention all the ones that were being sold to the government for massive research projects, one of which being Stretch, which I'll talk about later. But it definitely gave them the ability to gamble. And the biggest gamble they ever made was in 1965 when they announced the IBM 360 series, which will have a whole episode its own, not too far down. Thank you for listening and for supporting the 3 Minutes Modernist family of podcasts and Computer History with Chris Garcia. Hopefully, we'll have more of these in the next couple weeks.